Something is moving through the trees, keeping pace, staying just out of clear sight. The small group of people crossing this open stretch of ancient American grassland can feel it before they can see it, a presence tracking them from the tree line, patient, coordinated, unhurried. The grass around them barely stirs, yet something out there is moving in step with their own pace, matching every shift in direction, every pause, every moment of hesitation. There is no howling, no obvious warning, only the occasional flicker of movement at the edge of vision, low shapes drifting between distant trunks, never quite fully revealed. Then, for just a moment, it steps into the open. Not one animal, but several, moving as a single unit, low and broad-shouldered, with heads far too large and jaws far too powerful for anything a modern person would recognize as an ordinary wolf. This is not a story about wolves as anyone today understands them. This is the dire wolf, and for a very long time, the size of the animal behind the American West's oldest monster legends was not exaggeration at all. It was closer to a memory of exactly what these plains once carried. To understand how strange this animal really was, you first have to understand the world it was built for, because the dire wolf did not evolve in some empty, quiet landscape. It evolved inside one of the most dangerous and crowded predator ecosystems this continent has ever produced. Mammoths moved across the open plains in family groups, massive and tusked, capable of crushing anything careless enough to get underfoot. Enormous bison, considerably larger and more heavily built than any bison alive today, grazed in herds thick enough to shake the ground when they ran. Wild horses, native to this continent long before they vanished from it entirely and were later reintroduced from elsewhere, moved in fast, nervous groups across the open terrain. And alongside these massive herbivores moved something almost stranger still, giant ground sloths, some standing taller than a grown man, even on all fours, slow-moving but armored in thick hide and powerful enough to fight off almost anything that came too close. Herds of native camels, strange to imagine wandering across the American West today, moved alongside stocky, short-legged tapirs, both perfectly adapted to a landscape utterly unlike the one that exists here now. This was a landscape built at an enormous scale, and every predator living within it had to be built to match. That single fact should already be reshaping how you picture this animal, because a predator sharing a landscape with prey this large, this powerful, and this well-defended cannot afford to be small, cautious, or solitary. Everything about the dire wolf's build reflects the pressure of hunting in a world where the herbivores themselves could kill you just as easily as you could kill them. Pack size and coordination would have mattered enormously here, likely more than for almost any other predator sharing this landscape. Bringing down an animal many times the size of a single wolf demands numbers, patience, and a level of coordination that only comes from animals who have hunted together, generation after generation, refining the same basic strategy across countless individual hunts, most of them failed attempts that taught the pack something useful for the next try. A pack moving as a single unit could isolate a wounded or aging member of a massive herd, wear it down through relentless, controlled pressure, and commit to the kill only once the odds had shifted decisively in their favor. This was not reckless, chaotic hunting. It was calculated, patient, and almost certainly passed down through observation and experience within the pack itself. Each generation of pups learning the same hard lessons about exactly how much risk a hunt like this could bear before it turned deadly for the hunters as well as the hunted. Now picture the animal itself standing in front of you, because the difference between this creature and a modern wolf is not subtle. The dire wolf was heavier, more powerfully built through the chest and shoulders, with a skull noticeably larger and jaws capable of generating a bite force well beyond anything a modern wolf could ever produce. Where a modern wolf is built for speed and endurance, chasing prey across long distances until exhaustion sets in, the dire wolf appears to have been built for something closer to raw, overwhelming power, an animal designed to grapple with prey too large and too dangerous to simply outrun. Thick, heavy limbs suggest an animal built less for a marathon chase and more for a short, brutal confrontation, the kind of hunting strategy that only makes sense in a world absolutely packed with massive, dangerous prey. Stories of oversized, unnaturally powerful wolves stalking travelers across the American wilderness have circulated for generations, long before anyone could explain exactly where such tales came from. Accounts describe animals far larger than any ordinary wolf, moving in unnervingly coordinated groups, more deliberate and more patient than instinct alone should allow, capable of tracking a person or a herd for hours without ever fully revealing themselves. For a long time, stories like these were treated as simple exaggeration, the natural product of fear stretching an ordinary animal into something larger in the retelling. But knowing what actually walked this continent not so long ago, in evolutionary terms, changes how those stories land. A landscape that truly once held animals built exactly this way does not need much exaggeration at all to produce a legend. Sometimes a monster story turns out to be describing something that was, quite literally, real, simply separated from the storyteller by a gap of time too large to easily imagine. Here's where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn, the kind of detail that quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood about this animal. For a very long time, the dire wolf was assumed to be a close cousin of the modern gray wolf, simply a larger, more powerful version of the same basic animal, separated only by size and strength. That assumption turned out to be almost entirely wrong. Beneath the surface, in the deep genetic history of the animal, the dire wolf turns out to be far more distantly related to modern wolves than anyone expected, so distant that it likely diverged from the ancestors of gray wolves millions of years earlier than previously assumed, evolving separately, on this continent, largely disconnected from the wolf lineage that would eventually spread across Europe and Asia. For millions of years, while the ancestors of gray wolves were still shaping themselves on entirely different continents, the dire wolf's own lineage was already walking across American ground, following its own separate evolutionary path toward a body built for exactly this landscape and exactly these enormous, dangerous animals. In other words, the dire wolf was never simply a bigger wolf. It was something closer to a distant, independently evolved cousin that happened to end up looking remarkably wolf-like anyway, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures into a familiar form, without ever sharing the same close ancestry the resemblance suggests. This is a phenomenon that shows up again and again throughout the history of life on this planet. Distantly related animals evolving strikingly similar bodies simply because they were solving the same survival problem in similar ways. A powerful, pack-hunting predator built to take down enormous prey looks a certain way almost regardless of its actual ancestry, because that particular body plan is simply what works, whether the animal wearing it evolved on this continent or halfway across the world. The dire wolf wasn't a wolf pretending to be something else. It was an entirely separate branch of the family tree that nature had, almost coincidentally, sculpted into something that looked remarkably familiar. Think of it this way: two families, living on opposite sides of the world, separated for generations, might independently arrive at strikingly similar solutions to the same problem without ever influencing one another at all. That is essentially what happened here, except stretched across an almost unimaginable span of time, and across an entire ocean of genetic separation. The dire wolf and the gray wolf were never really family in any close sense. They were two separate answers to the exact same evolutionary question, arriving from two completely different directions and somehow landing on results that, at a glance, look almost identical. And this raises an immediate, obvious question, one worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward, since it's easy to assume two similar predators simply couldn't share the same ground for long. If the dire wolf wasn't actually a close relative of the gray wolf, and both animals lived across overlapping stretches of this same continent at the same time, how did two different wolf-like predators avoid simply competing each other into extinction? The honest answer reveals something genuinely clever about how these two animals appear to have divided the landscape between them. Evidence suggests the two species likely specialized differently, hunting different prey in different ways across different parts of the same shared territory. The dire wolf, heavier and more powerful, appears to have leaned toward larger, slower, more dangerous prey, the enormous herbivores that demanded strength and raw power over speed. The gray wolf, lighter, faster, and built for extended pursuit, likely leaned toward smaller, quicker prey across more open terrain, relying on stamina rather than brute force. There is even reason to think the two species avoided each other directly where possible, each recognizing, in whatever way animals recognize such things, that a serious confrontation between the two would carry real risk on both sides, with little to gain from the fight itself. Two predators, similar in size and shape from a distance, quietly avoiding direct competition by specializing into two very different hunting strategies within the very same landscape. It's a strange kind of peace, two apex predators sharing a continent not through conflict, but through simply not wanting the same things. That distinction becomes even more important once you step back and look at the full predator ecosystem the dire wolf was actually part of, because wolves, of either kind, were far from the only threat roaming this landscape. Saber-toothed cats stalked the same territory, ambush predators built with enormous, curved canine teeth capable of delivering devastating strikes to prey many times their own body weight. American lions, larger than any lion alive on Earth today, move through the open plains as solitary, powerful hunters. A strange, long-legged cheetah-like predator, built for extraordinary bursts of speed, chased down smaller, faster prey across the open grassland, filling a role no modern American predator occupies anymore. And towering above nearly everything else, short-faced bears, some of the largest land predators this continent has ever produced, stood taller than a grown man, even on all fours, capable of covering enormous distances at surprising speed when the moment demanded it. This was not an ecosystem with one dominant predator sitting comfortably at the top. This was a crowded, competitive kingdom of apex hunters, each one large enough and dangerous enough to challenge almost anything else living within it, all competing for space, prey, and survival across the same stretch of ancient American ground. Here's something worth pausing on, because it changes how you should picture every single encounter in this landscape. Being the largest predator here did not mean being safe. A dire wolf pack bringing down an injured bison might just as easily lose that kill to a short-faced bear willing to fight for it, or find itself suddenly vulnerable to an ambush from a saber-toothed cat while distracted by the hunt. Imagine the moment itself, the pack finally exhausting a wounded animal after a long, grueling pursuit, only to hear the low, unmistakable rumble of something far larger moving in from the tree line, drawn by the same scent of blood and effort. There would be no fighting for that kill, only retreat, the pack forced to abandon hours of dangerous, coordinated work in a matter of seconds because something bigger had simply decided the meal was no longer theirs to keep. Power in this world was never permanent. It had to be constantly defended against prey, against rival predators, and against the sheer, unforgiving scale of the landscape itself. Now, picture something else entirely, something that will completely reframe how you understand this era, because one of the strangest and most visually striking parts of this entire story happened in a place that would one day become one of the most recognizable cities in the world. Long before roads, buildings, or a single modern structure existed anywhere nearby, this same stretch of land held something almost unbelievably dangerous hidden directly beneath the surface. Natural pools of thick, dark, sticky asphalt seeped slowly up through cracks in the earth, often disguised beneath a thin, deceptive layer of dust, leaves, or shallow water. An animal wandering across what looked like solid, ordinary ground could suddenly find its legs sinking, trapped, unable to pull free. And here is the detail that makes this location so strange and so significant. A single trapped, struggling animal calling out in distress would draw predators toward it almost instantly, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Those predators, in turn, would often become trapped themselves, pulled down into the same sticky ground while attempting to seize what looked like a helpless, guaranteed kill. Layer after layer, generation after generation, this single deceptive stretch of land quietly preserved an almost unbelievable record of exactly which predators dominated this landscape. And in staggering numbers, dire wolves appear again and again among them, caught in exactly the same trap, drawn in by exactly the same desperate instinct. Picture the scene as it likely played out, over and over, across countless individual afternoons in this landscape. A single bison, already weakened, wanders unknowingly onto the deceptive surface and begins to sink. Its distress calls carry across the open ground, and within minutes, the first wolves arrive, cautious at first, circling the trapped animal, testing the ground at its edges. Hunger wins out over caution. One wolf steps too close, and the same invisible grip that holds the bison closes around its own legs. More wolves arrive, drawn by the chaos, some pulled in by the same trap, others watching from a safe distance, unable to help and unwilling to leave an easy meal behind entirely. By the time the scene finally falls silent, the ground has claimed several animals at once, predator and prey locked together in the same patch of earth. A single afternoon's tragedy quietly becoming part of an enormous, layered record that would still be sitting there, remarkably intact, long after everything else about that world had changed beyond recognition. Think about what that actually implies for a moment, because it says something almost uncomfortable about how these animals lived. If dire wolves were being drawn towards struggling, trapped prey in such overwhelming numbers, it suggests packs willing to take enormous risks for a meal, animals living close enough to the edge of survival that even an obviously dangerous, unnatural trap was worth the gamble. Power and desperation, it turns out, were never far apart in this world. From there, the story shifts to something entirely different in tone, quieter, more haunting, and in its own way, even stranger. Far from the crowded predator kingdom of the West, in a very different corner of this same continent, an ancient landscape once held soft, damp ground beside the edge of a shallow lake that has long since dried away entirely. On that soft ground, footprints were pressed down and preserved, layer after layer, an entire frozen sequence of movement captured in a single moment and held in place for an astonishing length of time. Human footprints appear here, walking steadily in one direction and running alongside them. In some sequences are the unmistakable tracks of a large, powerful, four-legged predator, moving with the same purposeful direction, close enough in timing and placement to suggest something almost unbearably tense, a human presence being tracked, followed, or perhaps deliberately avoided across the same stretch of drying, ancient lakebed. Try to imagine walking that same stretch of ground yourself, barefoot, in that world, aware on some level that you were not entirely alone. Every step pressed a little deeper into the same soft surface that would, against all odds, still be holding that exact impression an almost unthinkable length of time later. There is no way to know, from the tracks alone, what happened next, whether the predator peeled away towards some other target, whether it simply continued past without ever making contact, or whether the walk ended in something far more dramatic that never left a trace at all. The ground kept the beginning of the story and nothing else, a single frozen fragment pulled out of an otherwise silent, complete, and entirely lost sequence of events. There is something genuinely eerie about standing, even only in imagination, at the exact spot where these two sets of tracks run alongside each other. A frozen moment of tension between predator and person, preserved by nothing more than damp ground and sheer accident, outlasting the lake itself, outlasting the animals that made them, outlasting almost everything else from that entire vanished world. The landscape that created those tracks does not exist anymore. The lake dried up, the soft ground hardened, and the world that shaped both sets of footprints changed so completely that nothing recognizable from that scene remains today, except the tracks themselves, holding a single frozen instant from a world that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. And that single detail is the perfect hinge point for the final, most important turn in this story, because everything described so far, the massive herbivores, the crowded predator kingdom, the desperate traps, the frozen tracks, existed inside a world that was, without any warning its inhabitants could have possibly understood, already quietly beginning to collapse. The end did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived instead as a slow, layered unraveling, several separate pressures converging at once until the entire system simply could no longer hold itself together. The climate began shifting, warming gradually in a way that reshaped rainfall patterns, vegetation, and the delicate balance that had allowed such enormous herds of prey animals to exist in the first place. As the climate shifted, the vast herds themselves began thinning. Mammoths, giant sloths, ancient horses, and outsized bison, all declining across overlapping time frames. Each species reacting to changes it had no way of adapting to quickly enough. And that decline in prey struck directly at the heart of everything the dire wolf had ever depended on for survival. An animal built specifically, powerfully, and almost exclusively for taking down massive, dangerous prey has no fallback plan when that prey simply stops being available in the same numbers. Unlike smaller, more adaptable predators capable of shifting toward different, smaller prey when conditions changed, the dire wolf's entire evolutionary identity was built around a hunting strategy that only worked in a world overflowing with giants. When the giants began disappearing, the dire wolf's advantage disappeared right alongside them. There is a particularly cruel detail hidden inside this collapse, one that likely made the ending even faster than it might otherwise have been. A pack built around bringing down massive prey needs a great deal of food to sustain itself, far more than a smaller, more solitary hunter would ever require. As the largest herbivores grew scarce, the packs would have needed to travel farther, take greater risks, and compete more fiercely for what little remained, all while their own numbers were already beginning to shrink under the same pressure. Every attempt to compensate for a shrinking world likely accelerated the same decline it was trying to survive, a downward spiral with no clear way out once it had truly begun. This is the part of the story that deserves real attention, because it reveals something almost tragic about specialization. Being perfectly built for one specific world can become a fatal weakness the moment that world starts to change, no matter how successful that same design once was. The dire wolf wasn't outcompeted by a faster, smarter predator. It wasn't hunted into extinction by any single dramatic force. It was simply built for a version of this continent that stopped existing, and there was no version of itself flexible enough to survive what came after. Region by region, the great packs that had once ruled this crowded predator kingdom began thinning, the same slow, rolling collapse that eventually took the saber-toothed cats, the American lions, and the towering short-faced bears alongside them. An entire tier of apex predators, animals that had spent countless generations competing at the very top of this continent's food chain, simply ran out of a world capable of sustaining them. The crowded kingdom did not fall to a single conqueror. It fell because the throne itself quietly disappeared out from underneath every animal sitting on it at once. The ripple effects of that collapse would have spread outward in ways almost impossible to fully trace. With the largest, most specialized predators gone, smaller and more adaptable hunters, animals like the gray wolf, the coyote, and various mid-sized cats, found themselves with far less competition for whatever prey remained. Ecosystems tend to fill empty space quickly, even when the space left behind once belonged to something far larger and far stranger than anything filling it now. The modern predators that still roam this continent today are not simply smaller versions of what came before them. They are, in a sense, the survivors of a much larger, much more competitive kingdom, occupying a landscape that has been quietly scaled down around them, generation after generation, until almost nothing remained to suggest just how much larger and more dangerous this entire world once was. And now, bring yourself back to the present, to modern America, standing somewhere in an ordinary forest, an ordinary open plain, a landscape that, on the surface, looks almost unchanged from thousands of years ago. The trees still stand. The wind still moves across open grassland the same way it always has. Rivers still cut through valleys following paths that existed long before any of this history began. Deer still move quietly through the treeline at dusk, and coyotes still call to one another across open fields at night, small, distant echoes of a much larger, much stranger world that once occupied this exact same ground. But something essential is missing from this picture, something that no amount of untouched wilderness can quietly restore. This landscape once carried an entire kingdom of enormous, dangerous, extraordinary animals, moving through it in numbers and combinations that nothing alive today can come close to matching. Stand in a quiet forest clearing now, and nothing will move through the trees the way that pack once did, patient, coordinated, powerful enough to challenge a bison twice its own weight. That kingdom is gone, not because the land failed it, but because the animals that built it were never able to outlast the changing world around them. Every old story about a monster wolf stalking the American wilderness carries a strange kind of honesty buried inside it, whether the people telling those stories ever realized it or not. The monster was real, once, on this exact continent. It simply arrived too early to leave anything behind but bones and sticky black ground, footprints in a lake bed that dried up long ago, and a shape that somehow kept surfacing in story after story, passed down across generations who had no way of knowing exactly how close to the truth they actually were. The forests are still here. The plains are still here. But the animals that made this world what it was are gone.